Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Fox Talk. In a second, I'll pass over to my speaker this evening, Trevor Williams of the Fox Project in London. I can't get a housekeeping slide up this week, but just to let you know, there are closed captions available, and thanks to the Friends of Holland Park for their continued sponsorship of our talks. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section of the Teams live event, and we'll pick them up at the very end. Trevor's planning to talk for about an hour or so, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Trevor, and thank you, Trevor, for joining us this evening, and thank you.
Hi folks, well, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the red fox. My approach in talking about the red fox tends to be along the lines of the experience I've had with the Fox Project. So we're talking really about what the Fox Project does and bringing in what the fox actually is in the process. I apologise a little bit for the video, for the visuals, because I've not done this before, and I haven't found a way of not having the little slides down the side of the main slide. So there's going to be, hopefully I'm not going to be intruding on your concentration too much by my arrows and flipping in and out, but I'll do my best to get it right. I'm sure you're all very comfortable at home. You might like to know that I'm very uncomfortable at home because I've never done a talk in this way before, but I'll do my damnedest. So good luck to you all, and to me. Okay, the red fox. What is the red fox? Well, the red fox is the one species of fox which you'll find on every continent of the world. It's in Britain. We have a population which is around about 600,000 at its peak, and halves every year, which sounds a little bit kind of scary in terms of the mortality rate. But in fact, all that happens is that they breed back to those same numbers lost every year. So it pretty well stays at 600,000 on average each year. The fox population in Britain has dropped considerably since about 1995. It's fallen by about 43% overall. But we still know there's around about 600,000 because it was underestimated in the early by earlier research. And so the population we've always said it was still remains what it always said it was, but it's 43% lower than we thought it was. Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense to me. London in itself has a population that's probably estimated as being at a peak of about 15,000 pre-breeding season each year. And once again, that halves to around about 8,000 or so, and breeds back to the same numbers. When people talk about fox populations soaring through the roof or doubling every year as mayors like, you remember Boris Johnson? He used to be one of the mayors. He used to talk a lot about the fox population doubling every year, and something needed to be done about it. I don't know what he thought was going to be done about it. Nothing was. Nothing needed to be. But it's entirely untrue. The fox population has not increased. As I've said, it's decreased. So we're not being overrun by them. Now, in terms of what the Fox Project does, we're three things. We're a wildlife hospital. We're a wildlife information bureau specialising in foxes, of course, and we're also a fox deterrence consultancy. That may sound a bit anti-fox, but the basis of fox deterrence is it was a means of overcoming the ignorance, really, that was around up until the mid-80s, mostly with local authorities, where anybody that complained about foxes in the garden was met by a council saying, OK, we'll send somebody around to shoot them. And that's kind of what happened. And we, in our early days, we realised that local authorities were actually responsible for killing far more foxes across the UK, probably 5 times as many as all the hunts in the country put together. So, but it was under the radar. Nobody was seeing this happening. When we found out about it, we thought, well, something needs to be done about this. And the option we came up with was fox deterrence, which is using the fox's own psychology against it to disrupt its control of its own environment and to try and dissuade it from using people's gardens where they're not happy with it. That has, over the years, that has been taken on by every local authority in the country except for one, which is the Isle of Mull. Well, that's okay, because the Isle of Mull doesn't have any foxes, so we actually do have a 100% record in terms of encouraging councils not to kill foxes. Nothing's happened as a result of that. The fears were from some people that it would mean that foxes weren't being controlled, whatever that word means, and that they would increase dramatically. And of course that hasn't happened, because they are a self-controlling, self-regulating species by and large. Now, talking about the various things we do, I said about being a Wildlife Information Bureau. Well, one of the things we have to do is to counter some of the stuff that crops up in newspapers. I say newspapers, but I mustn't knock the Daily Mail, actually, because our Wildlife Hospital finds that it is the best newspaper to line out fox pens, the most absorbent. And the interesting thing is, no matter what it absorbs from the foxes, it doesn't change the content of the newspaper at all. One of the things we have to do, of course, is to try and counter some of the misinformation that comes through newspapers that don't research their subject very well. And some of the tabloids are very, very guilty of that. The Wildlife Information Bureau covers a number of things. It's there for people that like foxes, and it's there for people that don't like foxes. So for people that like foxes, it's there to assist them in sort of saying, well, how do we treat a particular infection or injury, or what's the best thing to feed them, or should you feed them at all? And on the other side, for people that don't like them, then we've got the Fox Deterrence advice and associated consultancies that deal with that kind of stuff. So that covers that side of things. Now, the Wildlife Hospital side is something that we never anticipated getting involved with in the first place, but we began through, well, nearly 30 years ago now, and just as the Wildlife Information Bureau, and we started to get calls from people saying, I see you're the Fox Project, so do you do rescues? Because we've got a poorly cub in the garden, whatever. And we got involved with that because I thought, well, okay, we can do a few. It's not going to get in our way. We can pick up a few things and pass them on to a wildlife hospital that I used to be a volunteer for. So, you know, we were just doing the initial thing. And the first year we did that was 1992. And we rescued 3 foxes. And I thought, well, that's a doddle then. It's not going to get in our way at all. Just 3 foxes a year. 7 years later, in the year 2000, or 8 years later, in the year 2000, we peaked at 750 foxes coming in per year. So that was a mistake, getting involved in wildlife rescue. But it's become our major thing now, of course, and we are now the foremost wildlife rescue, wildlife rehabilitation group in the country specialising in foxes. That side of things starts in spring, of course, when everything's born. And I guess we have to start with the mating season, which will be starting around about Christmas, midway through December, whatever. Those of you that sleep with your windows open will be fairly familiar with it, because the noise that mating, communicating males and female foxes make is pretty startling, can be pretty startling. And the shriek of the female fox, the shriek of the vixen, still gets the hairs upon the back of my neck. Although, as you can, those of you that are looking at me rather than this fox cub at the moment will realise that those hairs on the back of my neck are the only ones that could be standing up. Cubs are born round about, starting from about the middle of February through to early June. The majority of them in March, early April. When the mating season begins, and anybody's foxes are successful in breeding, they've got 53 days before the actual birth of the cubs. And in general, it's a litter of 5 cubs. There can be 4, there can be 3, there can be 6, and we've even known something up to about a 9 or a 10 at times, which is pretty dramatically out of kilter. 5 is the normal sort of size. We get called out for cubs which are found in the garden by people who think they've been abandoned, and often they haven't. They've just been dropped by a vixen going through the garden, going from A to B. You've opened the patio door, you've startled the vixen, she's dropped the cub. You think the cub's been abandoned, and all that's really happened is that the vixen has gone into cover and is waiting for you to move on so she can come back and recover her cub. But in the meantime, you've intervened and you've picked up the cub and you've contacted the wildlife hospital, and it's had to come in away from its proper mother, which is a shame sometimes. There are ways and means of overcoming that. We get involved every year with getting cubs back to their rightful parents, and it's something that is relatively easy to do if you understand how they operate. This particular vixen that you see here was one of our volunteers was called out to a household where they'd taken down a shed, and underneath it they found cubs which they hadn't realised were there, and of course they had no idea what to do with them, so they called us up and said, you know, what can we do? Are you going to come and get the cubs or what? Well, we got one of our volunteers out instead to monitor the situation, because the hope is that the vixen would come back for the cubs. She's alarmed at the moment, she's disappeared, but she may come back. And he sat back as we instructed, and kept out of the way, and just kept watch for the vixen to come back. She did so, and he captured the whole thing on camera. Up she came, she went over to the collapsed shed by passing underneath this piece of decking to start with, got to the shed, crawled underneath the baseboard, picked up a cub, brought it out, walked it away, picked up another one, walked that away. And she did so until she got the whole group of cubs out and moved them on. Now, that's the same principle we use if we're, I mentioned deterrence, and if we've got somebody who wants cubs moved on or foxes moved on from their garden, we'll use mild non-toxic repellents to encourage her to move on and to take her cubs away out of what she regards as harm's way, because she thinks the repellent is the scent mark of another animal, which is a threat to the cubs. You may think, well, in doing that, you've made them homeless, but no, we haven't, because when you get towards the mating season, every vixen, every fox in fact, thinks it's going to breed. The majority won't. Only it's reckoned about 50% or 40%, I'm sorry, 40% of foxes are vixens, and only 15% of those will have cubs in any 1 year. So it's only a minority of vixens that do have cubs, but they all think they're going to, and therefore they will all establish as many potential breeding earths as they possibly can, under people's garden sheds, in banks, in undergrowth, anywhere they can possibly find. So they'll end up with maybe 3, 4, 5 different potential breeding earths ready for cubs to be born. When they are born, they'll be born and kept in what they regard as, or what the mother regards as, the safest, most secure breeding earth. But if she's disrupted in any way by our repellents or by this shed collapsing because people are taking it down and putting up another one or using the land for some other purpose, then she has these other backup options to move on to. And the speed at which this particular vixen removed her cubs one by one by one by one was so fast that the other option that she had must have only have been 2 or 3 gardens away, and that's almost always the case. So foxes, if they have proper jobs, they'd be insurance agents, they've always got a backup plan. So we never worry about moving them on. When we get a call about a poorly fox, injured fox, or whatever the case may be, then that's when our wildlife ambulances kick into action. We have 3 ambulance drivers operating for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. And they are self-controlling in terms of when emergency calls come in, they go straight to the ambulance, they go straight to the driver that's on duty, and they are responsible for taking care of those jobs. They first off will bring them back to our wildlife hospital, which is just a couple of miles south of Tunbridge Wells. We share it with another wildlife hospital called Folly Wildlife Rescue, who rescue every species except for foxes, because they don't need to rescue foxes because we're just over the yard in one of the other buildings. That's where they will start off, and that's kind of kitted out pretty well the same as a vet surgery, nothing very different to a vet surgery, same kind of cages, same kind of facilities. And that's where the foxes will start off their treatment. If they're cubs, they'll come to our cub unit, which is about 8 miles away from our wildlife hospital, on my own property, and that's just a smaller version of the same kind of thing. When cubs are coming in, they're coming in at a very, very young age. To start with, at the sort of from a early, well, middle of February onwards, we're getting infants, and we're sometimes getting infants as single animals, or sometimes as entire litters coming in. And of course, the first thing you have to do is to get them warm, comfortable, and hydrated, because the chances are they've been out there a little while, they've lost what fluids they've got, and they're already beginning to be in trouble. So the first thing you have to do is get them on the bottle. That can be a bit tricky, and looking at this size bottle, you wonder how they even got it in their mouths. But it's once you get them on it, it's hard to get them off it again. They will down a tremendous amount of milk and hydrate themselves. Heat is also important. A lot of them are coming in not just dehydrated, but hypothermic as well. So therefore, you have to try to warm them as well as you can, and hope that they it's not to the core. I hope it's just superficially cold that they are, rather than deeply so. They're coming in at all sorts of ages, of course. As we move into the year, they're coming in a little older, and they're coming in as entire litters. If they're entire litters, then they remain that way. They remain a family group right for the whole time they're with us, right through the spring, the summer, and into early autumn, which is when we release them back to the wild. If they're coming in as single animals, then we have to group them into new artificial litters, and these two are a typical example of that. These two are just meeting now for the very first time, with a dolphin toy acting as the introducer, and they pretty well adapt to other cubs at this kind of age very, very quickly, and become a family, a new bonded family of their own. In fact, the funny thing is that cubs that are not related tend to get on better than cubs that are related, which says something about you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. Warmth is, of course, important, and these little ferret beds are a great way of keeping a family of cubs together. This little ferret bed has got 5 cubs in. You wonder how they could possibly get in, all cuddled down into it, but they will. If they're alone, then it's not just the ferret bed for one, you also get a toy. This sounds a little anthropomorphic that we give them toys, and we also give them names. It sounds a little anthropomorphic, but it's not. I mean, the thing is, giving them names is important because it gives them an identity, and it allows us to identify one cub from another. The alternative is to give them numbers, and nobody's ever going to remember that. They're going to remember names, so names are what they get. And as far as toys are concerned, they serve 2 purposes. One, they're another lump to cuddle up to, which gives them the impression they're with other animals of their own size, and also there's something to play with as they grow older. They're coming in for all sorts of reasons. This particular one was attacked by a cat and pretty well unzipped across the head, which was pretty dangerous for the animal. Cats are pretty lethal killers of fox cubs. It's an interesting thing that people sometimes worry about their cats being attacked by foxes, but far, far more situations arise where foxes are attacked by cats. This particular one, unzipped on the top of the head, had to be stitched right up, and as you can see, that's kind of misshaped the face a little bit. One eye turning into a bit of a Popeye, and it stayed that way after it healed. The cub came through it okay and did well. This one came in covered in tar, well, oil. In fact, it was from a company that was producing oil, and there were some waste pans with dirty, unusable oil outside, and a group of cubs that were born nearby stumbled into it and were just covered in this stuff. It took a lot of washes to get this stuff off, and apart from the danger that happily we didn't have to face was inhalation, which of course would have been far more serious. It took a lot of washes to get this stuff off, but at least they came through. These were kind of similar, some sort of toxic thing these cubs had stumbled into, and it affected their eyes quite severely. It took a long time to get those eyes back into good order and a good sight again. Nasty business. We have no idea what the toxins were. They're found by the side of the road. There was no sign of oil on them, so you know what they'd faced, we really don't know. These ones, a whole group, were born underneath a porter cabin on the building site, and when we got to them, they were just covered in sand, sort of soaking wet sand, and very, very cold, very, very wet. We did our best to try to get them back to the Vixen if we possibly could, by putting them in a box with a hot water bottle and just waiting for the Vixen to come back. Sadly, she didn't, and so we, bearing in mind this was kind of early March, I think, and very, very cold, we did have no option but to bring them in and bring them up. People wonder sometimes that, you know, okay, it's easy enough to handle cubs. They're little, they're tiny, they're not going to be aggressive, they're not going to bite you back. Well, actually they are, because they've got some needle-sharp little teeth if they feel like using them. But what happens with adult foxes? I mean, these are wild dogs. How do you possibly handle a wild dog without getting chewed up? Well, the funny thing is with foxes is they're easier to handle than cats. I say this as somebody that lives with 4 cats, and if you scruff a cat, if you disable a cat by managing to sort of confine all 4 legs, somehow or other it's still got another leg, and that's got claws on the end of it, and they've got pretty sharp teeth as well. They are dangerous animals. Foxes, nothing like that. You scruff a fox, scruff it properly, don't scruff it, don't hit it, but scruff it properly, and a fox will just tend to take the view that it's a fair cop governor, I'll come quietly. They're really quite easy to handle, but you never take them for granted, because they do have a sharp end. They don't have dangerous claws in the way a cat does. They have broad, blunt, digging claws, suitable for running, suitable for digging, but they're not killing claws, so they're not really such a problem to have to deal with. Handling a fox is not such a big deal as a lot of people think it might be. What other problems do foxes come in? Well, all sorts of injuries. Not a lot of things which you could put down to humans doing anything deliberately against them. More negligence sometimes with leaving rubbish out, which they can get tangled up in, netting, that kind of stuff. It's interesting how people worry about things like barbed wire and razor wire and stuff like that as being dangerous to wildlife. But in fact, probably the most common problem we get with foxes being caught up in anything is netting, garden netting, ordinary garden netting, the kind of stuff that you use around your plants. It's incredibly dangerous. You get caught up in that and you just wriggle and roll and tussle yourself up, and you get in such a situation that eventually the stuff's just cutting into you, and as it cuts into you, it's opening serious wounds on your body, and those serious wounds, if they're very deep, can become infected. We have to deal with those. The only sensible way of dealing with those is by keeping the wounds as clean as you possibly can, but also using something like, rather than some of the veterinary treatments that are available for wounds, we'll often use dried rosemary, just the stuff that you buy over the counter at Sainsbury's. That stuff is amazing. It's a natural antibiotic. It also dries into a kind of a scabby crust which protects the wound overnight, so you can clean it out the following day and clean it out again. And every time you do clean it out and expose it to the air, you'll find that the wound is closing over again, more and more and more. It's an amazing property, that stuff. Amazing. It has amazing properties, and it is actually better than anything a vet can supply you with. It's just remarkable. But that stuff is a lifesaver, and it's what we will almost always have to use if an animal gets caught up in this kind of netting or wire or fencing or anything like that, and gets almost cut to the bone. Some of the things that animals get caught up in, you would hardly credit. I mean, there are some things that we all know not to leave lying around, such as open cans, particularly cans where if an animal gets its head in, it can't get back out again without lacerating itself even more. We know not to do that. We know not to leave out all kinds of little bits of rubbish. We've learned over the years that things can be very, very dangerous to wildlife. This is the first time we ever came across this. What does this look like? Well, it doesn't look like anything particular at the moment, but when you take it off, when you cut it off, you find you've got the top of a cereal box, nothing more than that. And what's happened here has been perhaps a discarded cereal box. The fox, when it was a youngster, has got its head caught in it, not been able to get it off, and as it's grown, it's just become tighter and tighter. By the time we caught the animal, it was pretty well an adult, and when we cut it off, thankfully it hadn't cut into the animal's skin, but it was getting tighter and tighter to a point where it wouldn't have been able to survive for very much longer. It would have effectively been strangled. I suppose parasites are one of the things we deal with more than most. People tend to assume that foxes suffer a lot with fleas, and interestingly enough, they don't. Most of the fleas they carry tend to be cat fleas, which they've obviously picked up from cats, but they seem to cope extremely well with fleas and manage to keep the flea burdens very low. When we do find they've got a severely or a high burden of fleas, it's usually because there's something else that's the problem, not actually the fleas. The fleas have just taken over the animal because it's debilitated by something else, some other reason. And of course, we deal with things like ticks and maggots as well. They're par for the course when you're working at a wildlife hospital. With foxes, there's a particular thing that we have to deal with a lot. And I would think probably 15 to 20% of all the foxes that we take in because they're suffering from mange, sarcoptic mange, canine mange. The bells of doom are sounding in the background, but that's just our chiming clock, so I hope it's not overpowering me. Mange, well, this is mange, probably not entirely at its worst, but pretty serious. As you can see, it's crusty. It's left a lot of the body exposed to the air. It's taken the fur away. What happens with mange? Sarcoptic mange is a burrowing mite, and it's very fast breeding. If you've got a few of them on you today, in 3 weeks' time, you could have several thousand. They breed dramatically, and the way they breed is to get into the skin, burrow into the skin, and they live in the subcutaneous area on the animal's body. What they will then do is to throw up the waste from their own body and, of course, irritate the animal acutely so that it's scratching itself all the time. So what you've got on the surface of the skin is lesions caused by scratching by the animal itself, self-inflicted wounds, and you've also got this build-up of muck and crust and debris which the mites have thrown up to the surface, and which in hot sun tends to bake into something which you can almost describe, well, it looks like dried river mud and is like a thick coat. I've known it to be as much as 3/4 of an inch thick. It's and of course the worst problem with that is nobody ever died of mange, but you die of skin infection because the skin can't breathe under all that crust. The first thing we will have to do if we get an animal in this kind of condition is to cover it with oil, just cooking oil, nothing more than that, and leave it overnight. Which sounds a little bit like a recipe, but it's not intended to be. What happens in the morning is that the oil has softened the crust and it's all fallen off in a kind of a crumble and exposed the skin. And you might have to do this for 2 or 3 nights before it's all off, but it comes off more gently than if you were trying to pick it off, which is of course going to injure even further the affected, infected skin. So that's the first thing you have to do. Before you do that, you can't even start to provide injectable antibiotics or an anti-mange injection because you can't see where the skin is. You can't see where the crust ends and where the skin begins. Now you can. Now the crust is off, you can get to the skin and you can start the treatment. This is not the most serious kind of mange because it's not crusty. So this is open skin open to the air. It's still pretty bad because there is going to be a lot of parasites on that one, and it definitely needs treating. We try to treat as much as we possibly can by cage trapping and bringing animals in when they're reported, and we do that as much as we possibly can. But in not every case can you apprehend the animal. a lot of foxes are far too wise to go into a cage trap, so no matter how much you try, they are not going to fall for that. So we've had to look at other options over the years. Now, you can't use veterinary mange medications out in the wild. It's dangerous. It's a mild poison, and it can damage other animals. It can kill a collie dog for a start. It's dodgy stuff. So we've had to look at more natural options. And one thing we came across many years ago now, probably more than 20 years ago, was recommended by a homeopathic clinic in Tunbridge Wells. Now, there may be those of you that think homeopathy's got no value whatsoever, that it's just too weak to do anything if it does anything at all. Well, we're not homeopathic fundamentalists by any means. We have found that arsenicum and sulfur as a treatment, excuse me, the phone is going, somebody else is going to be answering that. We found that arsenicum and sulfur, a combination that this homeopathic pharmacy came up with, has worked very, very well over the years as a natural way of treating mange in the wild without harming anything else. There are no side effects. You can't overdose with it. It, however, does not work on anything more than about 35% fur loss. If it's above that, if it's 40% and above that, the chances are it's not going to do the job. Having said that, we've known it to do the job, but I wouldn't count on it. It's a treatment for relatively mild mange, and it's easily obtainable, and as I say, not dangerous to anything at all in the wild. This is the worst kind of mange, a little like that earlier photo I showed you, but this is mange all over it. The animal is completely covered in the stuff. This is very, very serious. It's what we call elephant skin. It's thick. It's going to close the animal's eyes apart from anything else because of the irritation around the eyes. The parasites will gather around there and conjunctivitis will occur. And in many cases, we're bringing in cubs which have got no sight at all. They are sighted, the eyes are there, but you have to work on it to get them open and free of the crust again. So it's a nasty, nasty level. I said we don't have to deal with too much in the way of direct cruelty from people, and we don't, but we do occasionally find ourselves faced with situations where animals have been attacked cruelly. This one, you can see there's something like a pencil sticking out the corner of this vixen's mouth. It's not a pencil at all, it's a crossbow bolt. This animal was shot through the back of the head. The crossbow bolt has come out through the corner of the mouth, and yet the animal is still feeding, which is just remarkable. We did manage to get that resolved. The animal was operated on, the bolt was taken out, and we got the animal back to the wild. Now, that brings up a point. With adult foxes, we always return them to the place they came from. We never move them somewhere else. We don't hold with the idea of moving them anywhere else, and we'd oppose the idea of anybody doing that, because you're effectively moving an animal from the territory it knows, its own environment, where it feels comfortable, where it knows all the resources, where it knows all the dangers, where it knows the food supplies, everything like that. Put it somewhere else and you've immediately reduced its life expectancy by 50%, and that's not acceptable. Relocation is not something we're prepared to do. However, when you look at what's happened to this fox, what do? Do we move it somewhere else, or do we put it back where it came from, where it was shot with a crossbow? Will it be shot again? Well, we have a remedy for that. We did produce a leaflet which we gave out to all the households in the area. We knew who'd done this, but we couldn't prove it, so there's no way of prosecuting the person. But they also got a copy of the leaflet, and the leaflet showed a photograph of this fox. It also said that a cat had been shot also with a crossbow bolt in the area. It hadn't, but we said it had, because lots of people have got cats. And we said, if you come up with the person, proof of the person that did this, is £1,000 reward. Now, we never expected to have to give out £1,000 reward, because we couldn't guarantee a conviction, even if we knew for sure that the person had done it. But what we did know was the person had been leafleted just as well as everybody else had, and they're now looking out the window thinking, any of my neighbours could be turning me in at any point for £1,000 reward. I'm not going to do that again. And sure enough, That fox has been out there for the last 3 years, living a perfectly happy life. No other fox has been shot with a crossbow bolt, and that one remains safe. So all you really have to do is to put the frighteners on. And I have no compunction at all about telling fibs to get the better of a criminal. Putting them back where they came from. This lady here is a firefighter. Reasonably enough, it's a fire station. And she called us out for this poorly mangy fox, and we cage trapped it. And then at the end of its treatment, we called her up and said, "Would you like to see the animal when it's returned back to its territory?" And she said, "Yeah, I really would. It squares the circle, really. She's been responsible for it being rescued. Now she's seeing it go back to the wild in its own environment." So we took it back and we let her do the cage opening. That's just pleased as much at seeing that happen. Now, looking at that animal, you would be right to assume that it doesn't look great still. It looks like it's got mange. Well, yes, but it hasn't got mange. It's been treated for mange. The one thing we can't do is to grow its fur back. If we could grow its fur back, then I'd have grown some of mine back. Well, you don't know how to do that. But it's not necessary to grow its fur back. The best way of an animal or a fox growing its fur back is to put it back out in the wild again and allow the weather to generate fur growth. If you keep it in a nice warm environment away from the weather while its coat is growing, its coat will not grow because it's too warm. The body is not going to generate new growth. It doesn't need to. So going back out there is the best thing we can do. Of course, the important thing then is to make sure we don't get calls about the same fox and go out and try and cage trap and bring in the same fox again for treatment twice, because that would be well, it would be slightly dangerous giving the same treatment in a short space of time, but we don't want to do that. It's highly inconvenient for the animal as well. So what you can't see on that animal is something which we would ask people if they phoned up to say, I've got this very mangy fox and I live very close to the fire station near Maidstone. Can you come and rescue it? And the first thing we'll say is, has it got some blue dye on it? And if they say, yes, it has, we can say, we've already treated that. Because we use sheep dye. It's not harmful, it's not toxic. It comes off after a few weeks' time, but it gives us that chance of being able to put an animal back and knowing we're not going to recapture the same one. People have a problem with foxes in their gardens sometimes. This is where we get involved with the deterrence side of things, and they don't really understand why the animals are there, why the animal's there. Sometimes it's because there's a good food resource there. Sometimes it's because of security. Sometimes it's just because there's a water supply there. This particular animal, lady phoned up and she said, I've got this fox in the garden and it lets me get within about 2 feet of it. So there must be something wrong with that. So I said, well, where does it live? Does it live in the garden? She says, yes, it lives in the ivy on the wall. And I thought, what? It's a very thin fox if it can live on the ivy on the wall. But she went on to describe the ivy, and it turned out it was more of a cave. The ivy was grown right out of against the garden wall to a depth of about 3 feet. So the animal was living in a cave. So I said, okay, well, I'm still slightly concerned about its behaviour if it's allowing you within 2 feet of it. Tell me a bit more about it. And as she told me more about it, it transpired that she was only able to get within 2 feet of it because she was looking out of her kitchen window at it. So the animal, which perfectly understands that there's a window, therefore a barrier between the two of you, had no reason to run away. So, there's a lady that was educated there in the fact that foxes do understand barriers. They do understand what glass actually is, and it was perfectly happy to be 2 feet away from her, knowing it was safe on the other side. Where will foxes live in urban areas? I mean, people worry about, people sometimes say, we've got one person who keeps coming back to us again and again saying, why aren't you catching up all the foxes in London, what, 15,000 of them, and taking them back to the country where they belong? Well, no, they don't belong back in the country. These are urban foxes. They belong in the city. They've got generations of culture which says this is my kind of environment. Well, where will they live in the city? Well, most of them would just be born under people's garden shed, in areas by canals or streams or whatever, away from habitation, but really right amongst us. And one of the best places to see them is something like the old Victorian cemeteries around London. They're great places to go and see foxes, because they were once very well controlled, well maintained cemeteries, until they became non-profitable. They were all in private hands to start with. They became non-profitable because there was nowhere left to bury anybody. So basically the owners just walked away, left them all to be managed by what was then the London Corporation, Greater London Council these days, and they took them over and they did some maintenance on them, but they basically let them go back to the wild, which is great, because we've got at least 7 old Victorian cemeteries around London, which are just beautiful places, full of wildlife, great places to live. As far as the fox is concerned, it's got all the prey it needs and all the security it needs. So they're great places to be. What about this? Is this a natural place for a fox to be? Is it a good place for a fox to be? This is a rubbish dump in Watford, sorry, not Watford, in Wapping, a rubbish dump. And on the side of the rubbish dump is this heap of tyres just all scrambled around all over the place. Now that looks like a very unnatural place for a fox to be, but it isn't. It's a wonderful place for a fox to be, because it's right by a rubbish dump, which is replenished every day with food scraps and all sorts of stuff. There's natural prey there as well, because there are rats, rodents, mice. Everything is taking advantage of that food as well. The mice and rats are living amongst these tyres just as the fox is, and you can move into that pile of tyres, work your way through them in a way that a human can't. So you're safe in there. It couldn't be a better place to be. And with the rodents and mice in that pile of tyres as well as the foxes, then the foxes have effectively got breakfast in bed. So what could be wrong with that? One interesting place you'll often find foxes is at the back of supermarkets at night, where a lot of staff, and we've come across this so many times, a lot of staff will feed the night staff, the shelf stackers, will feed the foxes on their breaks when they go outside for a cigarette and a sandwich or something like that. And they're great places to be. We were approached some years ago by a French photographer who was intrigued by the fact that he'd come over from Paris, where there are very, very few foxes to be found in the city, to find that London had a very large and healthy population. He was intrigued by that. And he contacted us, and we put him in touch with a few places where he could photograph foxes. And one of them was a Tesco's at Sevenoaks, and that's where he was taking these photographs. He's a clever photographer. You might think this is a very lucky accident that he should get a photograph like that. But what you should realise is that right there on the end of the basket support is a piece of bacon. So you can pretty well guarantee that a fox is going to get there, so you can get the picture you want. He's a clever photographer. He also found that while he was roaming around at night on this site, that there was he could only get so close to the foxes. But what he did is he worked on some psychology. We've always said that foxes are not great at seeing people moving. At seeing people that are not moving. If you back yourself against a tree and stand stock still, they may look at you for a while and think there's something strange about that. But if you don't move a muscle, they lose interest, because there's nothing there. They decide there's nothing there. But you move that muscle, you move a muscle at all, and they've got you, they've clocked you, they've seen you. They are great at seeing movement. What Laurent, this French photographer, found was that he was only getting so close to the foxes, no matter how still and slow he was, until he came up with this idea. And that was, he realised that foxes weren't concerned about baskets. They'd seen baskets around all the time, but they didn't like humans' legs. So Laurent got himself a couple of old duvets, stuck them in a shopping trolley, got a big long stick, which he could row himself around the car park, and he was able to get within a couple of feet of the foxes. Great photographs. This is his second photographer that's taken this photograph from another basket. You can outwit foxes very well. You can use their own psychology against them. People worry sometimes about foxes because they're finding them around at times they don't expect to find them around. We get a lot of calls from people saying, oh, I've got foxes in the garden lying on the grass, or they're on top of the garden shed during the daytime. That can't be right, is it? They're nocturnal, aren't they? Well, No, they're not nocturnal. They're actually perfectly happy as diurnal as they are as nocturnal animals. They only are they only prefer to be nocturnal simply because there's less of us around in the middle of the night. There's less activity, there's less traffic, and there's less of us. During the day, they are prone to sunbathing if they possibly can get it. They love it. They like the daytime just as much as they like the night. It's just safer not to be moving around. So it's nothing strange about finding you've got foxes on your garden shed. People that don't like seeing foxes in their garden need to understand why the foxes are actually there. And one of the reasons they can be there is just purely water. There's a pond, you're putting out food for your dog or your cat, water for your dog or your cat, or there's just somewhere where rainwater gathers and provides a watering hole for the foxes or for all wildlife. And so that's got to be your first thing. If you don't like foxes being in the garden, then do away with any water sources you've got in there. That's as simple as that. And then they've got less reason to come. Food-wise, people worry about some people think for foxes as dustbin foxes. Well, that may have been the case some years ago when there were galvanized dustbins, but these days they can't get their heads around wheelie bins. They're far too big to topple over. They can't knock the lids off them. They're not dustbin foxes. They never really were dustbin foxes. They just use the added advantage of our food. So when people sort of say, well, I've got all these foxes around, it's because people are feeding them. Not true at all. They don't need us. I mean, I'm not going to say I don't feed foxes. I feed all the wildlife around where I live as much as I can because I like seeing it around. But it's more for me than it is for them. They don't really. Most animals, most birds don't need my support unless it's very, very cold, severe weather. The rest of the time they don't need it. But I put out food for me so that I can see the wildlife. But foxes are not going to be just basing themselves around the odd sausage roll you throw out in the garden, the odd sandwich, the odd half a lasagna or something like that. They are still in an urban area, still going to take natural prey if they possibly can. And there's plenty of that around. There's pigeons, there's rodents, there's even in some of the more open areas, there's rabbits. So there's plenty of stuff around. And urban foxes will hunt just as much as rural foxes. There are some folks who think rural foxes are the real foxes because they hunt all the time. Well, no, they don't either. They are taking things that have fallen out of the trees and died in the night, that are just collapsed on the floor dead, or they're taking roadkill. They're not hunting all the time. There's no point in just putting yourself out as solely as a hunter as a means of providing for yourself, because, well, there was a TV series on some years ago where they showed foxes trying to catch rabbits, and they showed that only 1 in 18 attempts to catch a rabbit actually worked, actually resulted in a rabbit being caught. 17 rabbits got away. So that's not a great way to have to survive. You need to be able to scavenge as well, and foxes are great opportunists in terms of both hunting and scavenging. They need all of those kind of talents. If you're trying to, oh yes, rabbits, I mentioned rabbits, didn't I? This is another Laurent's pictures, and once again, the only way he got this was to put a piece of bacon on that rabbit's head. People are worried about their pets, like things like rabbits, and we get a lot of calls from people saying, I'm concerned about my dog or my cat because there are foxes in the area. Well, there are foxes in every area, but they are not generally a danger. This is a dog called Morris, and he's a member of a family of one of our volunteers. Morris is fed outside at night. His food's put on the back outside the patio windows, and he sits by his bowl and he doesn't eat anything until this fox comes out of the woods and down to join him, and then they eat together. I don't know how they became mates. I don't know why Morris decides to share his food with the fox, but he does, and that friendship has been forged for a good few years now. But as soon as the person as soon as Morris's parents, family are visible, the fox clears off, doesn't want to know whatsoever. But no danger to Morris at all. Morris's anyway is bigger than most foxes. I only know of 2 dogs in all the years I've been involved with foxes, which goes back to 1976, 1975, 6, something like that, I've only ever known of 2 dogs come off worse from foxes, and they were both Chihuahuas. And one of them was a Chihuahua breeder's puppy. And the fox came into the garden, and she saw it happen. She saw a fox pick up the puppy, shake it once, which broke its neck, dropped it, looked at it, almost shaking its head and going, "That's not what I thought it was," and left without doing anything more about it. And the lady herself was realistic enough to say, "Well, I know she thought it was, I know the fox just thought it was a rat," which is perfectly understandable when you look at a puppy Chihuahua. They're the only 2 dogs I've ever heard of coming off worse. There have been a few over the years that I've seen mentioned in the newspapers. Interestingly, 2 of them were in the Daily Telegraph, a paper that prides itself on being a bit more quality than things like the Daily Mail. And within the space of 2 weeks, they did stories on an Alsatian and a Labrador, which were both killed by foxes. Now, if they were both killed by foxes, given the difference in weight of what, 5.5 kilos for an adult fox, and probably 35 to 40 kilos for an adult Labrador or Alsatian, I don't even know what the weight is, but it's many, many times the weight of a fox. If that was possible, then you might expect to find a ferret bringing down a cow. It's just not going to happen. But interestingly enough, those stories coming as they did just 2 weeks apart, was in the week before the hunting bill was going through Parliament, and the Daily Telegraph was very, very supportive of hunting fraternity and didn't want to see that bill go through. Now that's quite interesting, because it's it kind of is kind of given the Fox Project an attitude towards the press which is not entirely healthy, and that in that we just tend to assume that sensation comes before genuine news and genuine research. It's unfortunately the case. Many more people phone us up worried about their cats. Now, as I say, I share a house with 4 cats. If a fox appears in the garden, one of those cats, 2 of those cats maybe sometimes, will see that fox off straight away. As far as they're concerned, the fox is on its territory and it's going to have to go. And that is almost always the same situation. Over the years, we've had, we must have a collection now of about 50 photographs, I suppose, of the people have sent in and said, saying things like, "Oh, you won't believe this, but my cat saw a fox away. It chased it out of the garden. You won't believe that. You've never heard of that before, have you?" No, only 49 other times, because we've got at least 50 photographs. We haven't got a single one of a fox attacking a cat, however, just the other way around. And sometimes actually being friends, but not always. Not always. Interestingly, you should never stereotype an animal anyway. You should never stereotype a species, because they're all individuals within that species and they've all got their own stories. They make friends with, foxes make friends with all kinds of animals. I've even known them be, one fox become friends with a lop-eared rabbit. Now that's not a little rabbit, that's a big rabbit, very big rabbit, almost the size of the fox itself, but they were friends. I've known lots of situations where foxes and dogs were friends, foxes and cats were friends. But who introduced these 2? Every day for 3 weeks on an animal sanctuary near Biggin Hill, this fox would come and sit with this goat in its paddock every day at the same sort of time and spend time together. I don't know what they talked about, but, you know, that's what I mean. You can't stereotype animals. Interestingly, when people worry about foxes, they're concerned about the population going through the roof and doubling every year and all that kind of stuff. What they don't realise is that foxes are not pack animals. They have to disperse. They have to go their own way every year, around about autumn, end of summer, early autumn. They have to go their own way. That's what's happening right now. If you're hearing lots of noise outside of squabbling foxes, this is what's happening. This is the Foxtrot. This is where the name of the dance came from, and it's an interesting means of not getting hurt, because predators aren't in the business of damaging themselves or damaging anybody else, or damaging other competitors if they possibly can. The better thing to do to avoid damage is to just pose, build yourself up, make yourself look bigger. Posture, make noise, do anything except attack. physically, because if you attack physically, you've given the other animal permission to attack back, and that means you can get injured just as badly as the animal you're trying to injure, and that can have an effect on your hunting and scavenging ability. So you don't want that to happen. So rather than that, it's arms up on each other's shoulders, mouths open wide, heads thrown back, and you push one another backwards and forwards until one of you finally gets down on all fours and just goes, oh, I've had enough of this. And that means that animal's admitted it's subordinate to the other one. So the other one is now the dominant animal. That doesn't necessarily last for long, because 20 minutes later, the one that's been beaten comes back out again and goes, I'm not having that. I'm going to go back and have another word with him. And this can carry on for several weeks. Now, this is something you can't do anything about with deterrence, because deterrence is all about using chemicals to upset territory, but it can't do anything about noise. And just because you've diverted an animal away from your garden, just stop it making noise under your window, you're still going to hear it 4 or 5 gardens away. So that's not really going to work. The only advice we can give to people who are suffering from this kind of thing at this time of year is to say, get down to Boots and have a look at their range of earplugs, because this ain't going to go away for a while. If you want to sleep, then that's your answer. I mentioned the way they avoid getting into battle, and posturing, much the same as you see your cats arching their backs to make themselves look bigger. Foxes will do exactly the same. Skirmishes, well, there may be a little bit of nipping goes on, but mostly if they manage to nip, it's going to be a back leg, because that means before they can get bitten back, the animal's got that you've just bitten has got to turn round and come back at you, by which time you've hopefully got out of the way. So once again, it's avoiding all-out war. Now we come to the last bit now of the talk. This is going back to our cubs again. Well, how do we get them back to the wild? These animals have been brought up on the bottle. They've never been in the wild. They've never been taught anything by vixens. Well, it would be overstating it to say that vixens teach cubs very much at all. They learn by observation. They learn by experience. But vixens don't physically go out to teach cubs anything. So they don't have to learn too much about that. It's all innate. It's all built in. And our system seems to work perfectly well in terms of getting them back to the wild. This year we got, I think it was about 220 cubs, hand-raised cubs, back to the wild. And only one gave us a little bit of concern that it seemed to be not wiring up properly. And that one finally did as well. So we got a 100% record this year in terms of releases. We moved them away from the hospital as early as we possibly can into outside pens, foster pens. People that have come to us and said, I would like to be a volunteer. If they would like to be a volunteer and they've got a garden big enough, we'll put a foster pen in their garden. And that foster pen will hold 5 cubs, a natural size litter of cubs. And they'll be away from us that they've known as the bottle feeders, so that's breaking that bond straight away, and they're with new people that they don't know. If they get too used to those people, then we move them from, well, Rita over there has got some cubs, David over there has got some cubs. They're both getting a little bit waggy with Rita and David, so we move the cubs across from one pen to the other. We swap them over. Now you've got 5 cubs who don't know these people, this person anymore. They've lost the person they trusted, and each time you do that, you've wilded them up a little bit more, and they're trusting people that little bit less. So we're trying to mirror nature as much as we can. We're trying to get them back to the wild at the right time. We're trying to get them properly wild and mistrusting of humans. We do this in a way which also provides them with plenty of space to run around and develop muscle tone. We give them toys. Toys are can take any form, and they don't have to be specifically cuddly natural things. They can be just any old thing. This kitchen roll insert is providing plenty of pleasure here for this cub, and this milk bottle here, enough pleasure for this particular cub, who is learning not just to play, but is learning hunting skills as well, because what it's doing here is jumping in the air to pounce, to come down with its front feet on what it regards as prey, in effect, in the same way it will later on when it gets out into the wild, and it hears a rodent in the grass, and it will do the same thing. It will jump up in the air, spring into the air, come down with both front paws, smack on the back of that vole, and kill it outright. This is teaching it to do the same thing. It's also providing a very interesting noise. So that's all to the fun. Furniture in those pens are important. Logs, planks, different places to different levels to get up onto to sort of see what's going on around you. It's all basically giving experience of different kinds of materials, coverings, whatever, tires to play in, tires to sleep in, tubes. I don't know what these tubes are, but these tubes will be found at the side of the road when there are roadworks going on, and at certain times of the night, in the early hours, we'll when these tubes are ripe, we'll go out and harvest a few, and we'll bring them back and we'll saw them into short lengths and we'll put them into pens. And these are really popular because the natural inclination for a cub, for a fox, is to, for security, is to be down a hole. And this is a hole. The natural inclination of a fox is not to dig an earth that's only got one door. This has got two doors. A natural earth should have two doors. It should have a back door, a way of escaping if something comes at it from the front. So this is a comfortable place to be. You can defend it, you can back out of it, you can go either way in it. They are very, very popular and very educational for the cubs. So we're teaching them something in the process. We also give them hutches. Now, hutches are sacrosanct. We don't go in them. We allow the cubs to come in and out of them, and the only way we'll ever open the door and go in is if we think somebody in there is poorly. This particular one, the camera was put through the door. We didn't go in there. We will not go in there. And the reason is because as time goes on, we want to, when we approach the pen, we want the cubs to scamper into cover, to take cover in the hutch, and realise that the best thing to do when you sense danger is to run for cover, run for home. Because when you get back out in the wild, that's what we want them to think is the safe thing to do. Run for cover, run for your hole, and know that you're going to be safe in doing so. If we were to keep going in and out of that hutch, it's no longer going to teaching them anything. It's no longer teaching them it's a secure place to be. It's teaching them that it's somewhere to go, but people will still follow you. So it's not teaching you to run down a hole when danger looms. This does, that process does. Other things that could go into pens are traffic cones, which of course no home is without. No home should ever be without. Certainly as a young student, my home always had a traffic cone in it, and I'm sure many of you also had a traffic cone and have no idea where you got it from. When you get towards the end of summer, or early autumn, you can walk into pens and walk up to pens, and the cubs will hardly notice you. They're looking into the middle distance, and you know that that's the point when they're getting the real pull back to the wild. They're getting that, it's approaching natural dispersal time. Cubs will naturally disperse from their families from any time from about 4 months to 5 months in most cases, and our cubs are the same. We release them at the point of the year when natural dispersal is going on. And where do we release them? We release them on areas which we've been provided with by householders, but never urban. Always edge of suburbia, or better still, rural. It will surprise some people to learn that many of our volunteers, many of our rehabbers, many of the people who release 5 cubs a year on their property, which is all we ever ask. We wouldn't want to release more than 5 on any site. Many of them are farmers. Now, if you listen to the hunting fraternity, or the shooting fraternity, they'll often tell you that all farmers hate foxes. No, they don't. Most farmers are crop farmers, arable farmers. They don't have a problem with foxes at all. They have a problem with rats and rabbits. Foxes control rats and rabbits, so they welcome foxes on their land. We've got 2 sheep farmers. Some people will tell you that that foxes take lambs all the time. Well, they don't, for the most part, take that many lambs. And usually when they do, it's because they're left out in the open areas far too long. And because, unfortunately, these days, sheep tend to have been bred to have twins. Well, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. Most of the sheep had 1 lamb. Now they have 2. that's harder to defend. And there's a lot of work going into trying to get sheep to have 3 lambs. That's going to be pretty indefensible. That means that newborn lambs that aren't protected out there are very vulnerable to foxes, and that's pretty well a self-generated problem. So that's a bit of an issue. But rehab sites are important to us, and we have, I think, something like 38, I think, release sites that we used this year, each with just 5 cubs, all released at the point of year when natural dispersal is going on, and when we're happy that all of their cubs are properly wilded up. These cubs have been released. They're coming back the following night because we don't just abandon them. We put food in the porch of the pen that they've been released from, and we carry on doing that for as long as they actually need it. Usually they've stopped taking that food from about 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks maximum, because they've started to find their own natural food out in the wild. And if you think they can't do that because they haven't been taught by the vixen, then we've been reassured by several occasions when we've filmed them the day after release or shortly after release or in the weeks following release, and we've seen them successfully catching voles, mice, rats, birds out in the wild and doing extremely well for themselves. So we don't really worry about them going back to the wild. We know they can cope, and back in the wild is where they really belong. And that's where I finish. So I think it's now kind of over to you. Thank you for listening.
Trevor, thank you very much for that. That was really informative and entertaining as always. Are you okay to answer a few questions?
I certainly am.
Excellent. So we've got a few questions. I will start from the first question, which is slightly out of sequence. But someone asked, can you tell the gender of a fox from its markings?
To be quite honest, only by instinct, and I'm often wrong even now, and this is so many years after I first got involved with foxes, it's not that easy at all. It was once kind of considered that a male fox was taller, it had a more narrow head, it was more jacked up really at the back, on the back legs, and the vixen was probably more squat and a wider, flatter head. There have been a number of theories thrown around over the years. Quite frankly, there's no guarantee that taking those descriptions will be one fox or another. I've seen foxes of both sides. I've seen big vixens going around with little tiny dog foxes that certainly are not bigger or stronger or heavier than the vixen, as people might assume them to be. I've been mistaken by, I can remember one particular situation where I thought I was watching a dog fox for quite some weeks because it always seemed to sort of cock its leg. And I thought, well, the vixen isn't going to cock her leg. Both sexes will squat when they urinate, but the vixen will not usually squat her leg. Well, she's got no reason to cock her leg. Until I realised that she was a vixen, and the only reason she was cocking her leg is she was always backing into this spiky blackberry bush, and that was causing her slight discomfort, so she raised her leg, and she got me fooled completely. So yeah, I don't think there's an easy way of knowing. By instinct, I probably am right more times than I'm wrong, but I can't quite tell you why I think something's male or female.
I have a question about Holland Park. I know you've been to Holland Park. Do you reckon what would the what's the phrase, carrying capacity do you think of Holland Park for foxes be? Is it be 1 pair or 3 or 4 pairs? I
think you've got yeah, we have got a long connection with Holland Park, and it goes back. It wasn't me that was involved, but we had a scientific student, a science student, ecology student that worked over with you many years ago, 20 years or 25, no, about 20 years ago, I think. And he kind of came up with a population expectation in the park, which I can't really remember. I think it was something like 6 regular foxes that he thought were there. Not necessarily living in the Holland Park, but more just kind of using it. I don't think he identified an earth actually in the park at all, if memory serves. It's a long time since those days, and I don't know what the current situation is. It may very well depend a lot on development or changes around the park. Although I don't think you'd have too many changes around the park.
There's been quite a lot of new building actually on one side of the park, yeah, and some new flats. So yeah, I suppose it varies.
Yes, it will vary, and it's. I mean, the thing is about Fox territory is it's a piece of string. I mean, there's. I remember years ago seeing somebody saying that a rural fox will have 3,000 acres. Whereas an urban fox will have 300 acres. Well, that's absolute nonsense. I've known some foxes to have to range over maybe about 10 gardens, and that's all they ever do because they've got all they need within it. A territory needs to be as small as you can possibly make it, so long as it provides everything that you need. Foxes are lazy. They don't need to. They don't feel the need to expand their range. They're quite happy with keeping it as small as they possibly can, because that way you can sleep longer.
And kind of following on from that idea about possible redevelopment, there's a question from Cynthia. She says there's a group of foxes living on a vacant site on our estate which is due to be redeveloped for housing. What is best for the foxes? Would they need to be moved or just let them find their own site by themselves? It's in North Ken.
Right. Okay. It's best not to move them if possible. I mean, we work with development companies, both building and demolition, where there's wildlife on site, and there are ways and means of encouraging. The same deterrence systems can be used to discourage them from being there. In the case of demolition, usually there's a lot of overgrowth as well, so that needs to be gradually removed as well. It will depend on the time of year, what kind of level of care you have to do with that. If it's cub season, then cubs are at risk and they're less likely to be moved on very quickly by a vixen unless she really feels hard pressed. But with adults, they'll move on of their own accord with a minimum of disturbance. So just the disturbance alone ought to get them to move on. But any company that feels that they need help, they only need to come to us, and we'll get some of our people out to help resolve it for them with no damage done to the animals. But there's no way you can persuade them not to do it. Foxes are not, they have no kind of legal status in terms of being protected, and therefore it's not like bats or badgers or anything like that. That work is going to go on, so you can't fight it.
No, thank you. Yeah, there's a question from Shannon. It's one of our first questions. She had a vixen and two cubs in her garden over the summer, but unfortunately the mother had mange,
Right.
which made her completely bald. And then it looked like it may have been passed on to one of the cubs, which was unwell and eventually died. Can that happen? Can mange be passed on from fox to fox? Mange
is very easily transmitted. It's by contact. It's not so easily transmitted by indirect contact. Sometimes if you're sharing a lying up space, then yes. If you're sharing an earth, there's a fair chance of it. And certainly with cubs to adults, where there's close regular contact, then yes, there's every chance it will be transmitted.
And is it a sign of stress, Trevor? Because I remember reading that Bristol has a good study of foxes, and I remember it saying that sometimes their population gets too much, and mange comes in as almost like a natural population reduction measure. No.
Yeah, that was kind of a bit. I do remember that terminology being used at the time. It's not strictly speaking the case. I mean, It wasn't so much stress. In terms of, it wasn't so much stress as much as density, population density. The more dense the population, then obviously the more cross-infection there's going to be. That's all it is. So it was a high population. That in itself is stressful, and I think that's where the term stress came into it. But it wasn't. It can't be caused by stress. It is a physical parasite, and it's either there or it isn't, stress or not.
Cool. And a few other questions. One asking red foxes. Are there any different colour morphs of foxes, like presume like black or albino foxes? Is that possible? Have you encountered those?
Yeah, we have. It's still in every case that we've ever come across, apart from a couple of escapee grey foxes, silver foxes, which look black basically for the most part. They're still all the red fox. I mean, the red fox is just the species name. It's not actually the physical description of it. Most foxes aren't actually red. Most foxes are a tawny, browny, grey colour. So, you know, but they are still the red fox. We've seen them. We've seen well, not albinos, but we've seen white foxes. They weren't albinos; they were just white. We've seen black ones. We even came across 3 piebald cubs once, which were black, ginger, and white, and strangest colour. So all of those pigments will be there, and there's kind of no specific colour that you can say an average colour at all. The average colour, I suppose, if you have to say it's an average colour, is a browny grey.
Cool. And then a question, which I think I know what you're going to say. Foxes, there was a story a few years back about a fox coming into a child's house and biting it. Is that a common occurrence, a rare event, I assume, is the question, how it's phrased? Well,
it's biting is always going to be, whenever these situations occur, they always seem to be where there's a genuine case of a nibble, and it's never more than a nibble. I mean, I know the case that is being alluded to here. I think it was actually twins in Hackney. From information we subsequently got, both that and another major case that hit the press hugely in Dartford in 2002, in both those cases it was the domestic household dog that was responsible. And certainly the kind of feedback we were getting was that from the police, from social workers, from a local vet in one particular case, was that in both cases the household was more concerned about the fact that they were going to be shown up to be bad parents because they'd allowed a situation where the domestic dog, perhaps jealous, whatever, who knows, of the baby, had attacked the baby. And rather than do that, they came up with the story of a fox coming into the house and biting it. There's never any proof of that. There's never been any proof of any of the situations that have hit the press and become big news. But it does happen from time to time. I do remember talking to a lady who woke up and found a fox nibbling her toe. Didn't do any real damage to her toe, but it got into the house by some means, perhaps through the cat flap or whatever. And I was just curious and inquisitive. It's always at the same time of the year when these genuine situations occur, and that's round about now, dispersal season, when you've got confused juveniles moving away from their family groups and they don't really know the ways of the world and they're making mistakes. That's all. It's always at this point of the year.
Thanks, Trevor. I'm going to merge 2 questions from a lady called, a man or a lady called Elle. They ask, are they in decline? Therefore, why are they still hunted? And are foxes better living in cities or the countryside?
Okay, multiple question.
Yeah,
they are not in decline. The population has fallen, but having said that, as I said earlier on, the population was underestimated prior to I suppose about 1995, and when the population was reassessed, it was found that it was higher than anticipated, but it's now come down by about 43% since 1995, according to a scientific survey. I wouldn't say in decline as much as they're just kind of just adapting to different circumstances. If you can't manage a sizable enough territory that's going to provide for a family, you basically don't have a family. They do have this kind of inbuilt thing about not overpopulating, and I think as our own environment becomes more and more dense, there's less and less ability for them to find a place amongst us to breed to the same sort of numbers as they used to. So I don't think it's decline. I think it's just adapting to a different kind of level. And even if they were in decline, I don't think it would be necessarily a permanent thing. Most species do have their ups and downs anyway. And you know, in recent memory, squirrels have. I mean, unfortunately, some species like hedgehogs and a few others are definitely in decline. But the majority of them just go up and down a bit, and foxes fall into that category. Sorry, what were the other 2 points there?
Yeah, sorry. It was asking, alluding to hunting, why they still hunted, and if you think they are better adapted at living in cities or in the countryside.
Okay, well, as far as living in cities or countryside, I don't think they're better adapted one way or the other. I think they are just adaptable, opportunistic animal that can survive in any kind of environment. So therefore, urban, suburban, rural, it doesn't really matter. It will all provide for them, and if it doesn't, they just simply won't be there. So I think any territory is fine as far as they're concerned, just as long as they can find everything they need in it. And I've gone and forgotten the other side of that question.
Yeah, no, sorry, it was just hunting. Hunting doesn't happen anymore, does it? No, for foxes.
Hunting does happen. Hunting is.
I was thinking of more like traditional kind of fox and hound type of hunting.
Yeah, that still goes on. It hasn't changed. Unfortunately, regardless of the law, you are looking at a section of society that has no respect for the law anyway, and never has. I mean, it tends to take the view that law doesn't apply to them, and so they are still hunting in just the same way as they always have. It doesn't have any real effect on foxes. I mean, the last time I saw any figures, and they hide their figures fairly well, the last time I saw any figures for the entire number of foxes killed by hunts across the country was 9,000 in 1 year. Now, 9,000 from a population of 600,000 doesn't actually change anything very much. Well, it does for that 9,000, of course, but it doesn't change anything in terms of the overall population. When you consider that something like 80,000 foxes are killed on the roads every year. So it's not a method of control, it's purely a sport. So it has nothing to do with decline. I mean, you know, if you were looking for a sense of responsibility about not hunting a declining animal, then one would hope that the hunting fraternity might stop hunting otters years before they did. But they took it right up to the wire until it was actually made illegal to do that. They're not interested particularly in conservation or decline, whatever. It's a sport, pure and simple. It's a sport.
Okay, thank you. And our last question that came in quite late from Helen. It's a nice one though. In addition to territories, how has the fox behaviour changed over time since you've been observing them, e.g. related to city life, construction, foods availability, human thinking with regards to non-animals? So it's quite just thinking of any sort of changes you've noticed, I suppose, about us considering foxes and foxes themselves.
Yeah, I think the only changes that have been that we've seen really, I don't know that it's been all that dramatic either. Urban foxes, for instance, have been in London, in the southeast cities and towns since just post-war. Really, they start to move in there, and they probably peaked in terms of numbers in the late 60s, early 70s. So that's the population itself probably hasn't changed a great deal since then. But I think what has happened is that foxes culturally, foxes that have been raised and brought up in urban areas, they seem to be tame. People think of them as being tame because they don't run away. They'll walk 4 feet away from you without worrying about you very much at all. And I don't think that's because they're tame in any way. I think, well, it isn't because they're tame, because, you know, from our rescue point of view, we'll find a wild fox. Trying to restrain a wild fox from London is just as hard as trying to restrain a wild fox from a countryside area. They're just the same. They just aren't going to have it. But what you do have in an urban area is foxes which have grown to understand this. They realise that they can walk 4 feet away from us, because by the time we make a lunge of 1 foot towards them, they've doubled that 4 feet to 8 feet. They're far faster than we are. They know that we're slow lumbering things and we're not dangerous. So therefore, they've kind of adapted to living very close to
used to us, almost a bit habituated, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but not to be confused with tameness.
Yes, indeed. Cool. Well, I think I'll wrap that up there, Trevor, if that's okay. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Like I said at the top, the Friends of Holland Park have been very supportive and always have been supporting our talks. And if you've seen in our chat, we've got a talk coming up in early November on peregrine falcons from a lady from the Hawk and Owl Trust. And again, another new talk on spiders from someone from the British Tarantula Society. So that one as its name suggests, will be pictures of spiders, so best avoid if you're an arachnophobe. Thanks again, Trevor, for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.